Welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where you get to watch me watching other people, looking at the people who are watching me, watching the people who are watching the people playing, who are watching the metagame. We're going to take a look at modern, pioneer, and standard formats on Magic the Gathering Online, take a look at some weekly challenges, and by weekly I mean weekend challenges. I usually try to look at data between Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. All of the challenges that take place during that time frame, we take a look and see what the metagame looks like, compare it to the prior week, see if there's any notable shifts. Shifts? Yeah, that's a word. And at the very end of each segment, we take a look and see if we can find some spicy deck lists littered among the top 32 of each challenge. And we are going to start things off, as we always do, with Modern. And I feel like I'm beating a drum at this point. I'm beating a dead horse. Modern, at least to me, if you talk about in terms of what different decks are viable and the amount the metagame share for each of those individual decks, I think Modern is probably the healthiest format right now. Maybe you could say something about the gameplay. Maybe there's something in there that you're not a big fan of. But in terms of just the health of the metagame and the number of different viable decks, seems like it's the most wide open. So Boros Energy up slightly, ever so slightly from last week, 12.5% to 14.7%. Esper Blink took a bit of a dip here from 11.3 to 7.1. Affinity, that took a bit of an uptick here, 6.6 to 8%. The affinity lists that have been doing very well are the ones with 4 Pinnacle Emissary, 4 Kappa Cannoneer. I'm pretty sure all of them had 4 Thoughtcast and 4 Thought Monitor as well, which makes sense because when you have Pinnacle Emissary paired with a bunch of zeros, that gives you a ton of material to cast stuff like Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor. Amulet Titan hanging in there at 4.5, Grixis Reanimator, roughly about the same. Dimir Murktide kind of fell off a little bit, 5.1 last week to 1.3 this week. There was only a handful of Dimir Murktide decks. Domain Zoo maybe making a bit of a resurgence. I will say a lot of the Domain Zoo decks that I saw had main deck copies of Doorkeeper Thrall, and if a lot of people are going to be playing Esper Blink, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Some of you may remember, maybe about 3 or 4 months ago at this point, back during the Modern RCQ season, the RCQ that I won during that season was with Zoo Scam, which was playing 4 Consigned to Memory and 4 main deck Doorkeeper Thrall to pair with 4 Null Drifter and 4 Flage. Maybe that's something you want to consider with how much blink there is. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is Azorius Control. Basically, not going to say non-existent last week, but 1.6. This week, now 6.3. And it did take down one of the challenges. I am going to show you that deck list. Even though I'm not a big Control fan myself, it's good to keep in mind and see what's winning and doing well. Other than that, metagame looks pretty straightforward. There's some changes within the left-hand side of the graph, but nothing too drastic or anything like that. So let's look at some deck lists. And as mentioned previously, the first deck we are going to take a look at is Azorius Control. Now, as I mentioned, not a huge fan of Control myself. I know that there are some Control lovers out there. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the playstyle, but I can respect and understand if a deck is doing this well and putting up results like this, maybe you gotta take a look at it. Now, what's interesting is the inclusion of Quantum Riddler, which may not seem like an Azorius Control card per se, but the really cool thing about Riddler is the Control deck already kind of wanted to play Solitude anyways, and now that you have Solitude and Quantum Riddler, you can actually play an Ephemerate package. And what that allows you to do is not only give you like this really powerful interaction tool because Solitude plus Ephemerate kills 3 creatures, it also gives you a way to pressure some of the combo decks, where on turn 3 you can go Warp a Riddler, Ephemerate it, hold up some sort of free interaction. I guess there's only 2 Force Negations in the main, but you have the subtleties as well. Buy yourself a turn, untap, now you have a 4/6 flyer with all of your mana untapped, and you can kind of go from there. Typical Control elements like Prismatic Ending, Counterspell, Wrath of the Skies, all that stuff you're probably used to. Consult the Star Charts is another new card here, which is very powerful because it allows you to play at instant speed. Before, you could play something like Stock Up, but it's a lot harder to stock up and hold up Counterspell on the same turn. So with something like Consult, if they play into your Counterspell, you get to use it, and if not, you get to use your mana on Consult, which can be on 5 lands, it's just a stock up anyways. So I like that. Teferi's main deck makes a lot of sense. Very good. A lot of people are playing at instant speed, especially the Esper Blink decks, because Ephemerate is a powerful tool for them, and Teferi shuts off the rebound of Ephemerate, so I like that as well. And yeah, just some blue-eye control cards in the sideboard here, nothing too crazy, but just wanted to kind of show you the evolution of the Azorius control deck, if you're into that sort of thing. Next up here from Mobe in 25th place. This is a Brightglass Gearhulk deck. Now, what's going on here is Brightglass Gearhulk has a plethora of options to be able to search for at the 1 slot. You have stuff like Esper Sentinel, you can set up God of Souls Ocelot Pride, there's a Haywire Might as well, so a lot of good tools there. You can also fetch up a Static Prison. And then you're also a Birthing Ritual deck, which Birthing Ritual, when paired with something like, say, for example, Brightglass Gearhulk, you can play the Gearhulk, Birthing Ritual, sack the Gearhulk, go get something like a Solitude, and then from there you have an additional powerful removal spell. And you can also just kind of chain stuff. There's a Ketramos here, where you have a lot of ways to exile, like Emperor of Bones and the aforementioned Solitudes. You have Severance Priest, which is kind of cool, where Severance Priest exiles the card from their hand, and then you can sack this to the Birthing Ritual, go get something like a Brightglass Gearhulk, and then you have some other powerful tools from there. Emperor Bones looks kind of weird, but as I mentioned, it is powerful with Ketramos, and it is a way to reanimate stuff like Solitude and Brightglass Gearhulk. So in any case, really cool looking deck list here from Amobi, and if you're into the sort of Brightglass Gearhulk Birthing Ritual stuff and you don't want to pair it with blue cards, maybe Abzan's the way to go. Wait, Boros Energy in the Spice category? Well, there is some interesting developments in the Boros Energy deck lists. Now, I will say, not all of them are doing this, but the one that I saw from Sir Samaj 429 here in 28th place was one of the few that are pairing Boros Energy with Halia. And Halia is very powerful for a couple of reasons. One, it in and of itself with Voice of Victory making 2 tokens. So if you have the natural curve of turn 2 Voice, turn 3 Halia, Halia triggers itself to gain a life. The Voice will trigger it 2 more times to gain 2 more. That's 3 for Halia. It's also a Soul Sisters, which means very powerful with Ocelot Pride. It's a way for you to trigger Ocelot Pride outside of combat, which is pretty important alongside Guide of Souls. So you have that angle as well. Ajani can make a lot of tokens to trigger Halia. Flage gains you 3 life. So even if you don't have a ton of creatures to be able to play with Halia, Flage gains 3 life. That's going to trigger it in the end phase. The other cool new addition here is Starfield Shepherd, which might not look fantastic because there's no ephemerates to pair with it, but it's nice because it can find you whatever half of the Guide Ocelot Pride package that you're missing. If you need whatever one you're missing, go grab it. In a pinch, you can maybe also grab a Ragavan. So some things to think about there, just pairing the Boros Energy cards with, I think, Halia specifically. This one makes a lot of sense. I'm less sold on Shepherd, but this is one that I definitely want to try it out prior to the upcoming regional championship cycle. And last but certainly not least here from Chew Dog in 31st place. We can ignore the 1-4 record for now. This is the Spice category. This is not the try hard category. So you might look at this deck list and you might say to yourself, this looks eerily similar to Esper Oculus, which is a deck that a lot of people were playing right around when Aether Drift came out. Aether Drift introduced Ketramos, and Ketramos, very powerful card with something like a Boron Oculus, Emperor of Bones, there's Solitude, bunch of ways to trigger it. Because if you Oculus to exile cards from the graveyard, that will trigger the Ketramos. So what's interesting about this is we've basically swapped the Ketramoses for Kishla Skimmers. Not quite as good because you'll notice there is a once per turn clause on Skimmer, and it's only during your turn. So even if you somehow exile a card from your graveyard on their turn, you don't get the draw card. So this one certainly has stopgaps, whereas Ketramos doesn't. But the nice thing about playing green is you get to play Malevolent Rumble, which you probably can imagine. You can understand why this card is good at putting Oculus in the graveyard, fueling your graveyard for a hardcast Oculus, and then again setting up for Unearth, but also letting you play Cosmogoyf in green. So Rumble mills a bunch of cards that get you cards for Oculus. Oculus is a way to exile cards to trigger Skimmer, to trigger Cosmogoyf. You have Psychic Frog that can also exile cards from graveyard to, again, trigger Skimmer and pump up the Cosmogoyf. You have Relic of Progenitus to pair with Skimmer. So there's some interesting stuff going on here. Is it better than Esper? Not really sure. But the inclusion of Cosmogoyf at least makes me think maybe there's something here. And that's going to do it for Modern. Let us go and see how Pioneer's looking these days. Okay, Pioneer players, I see you over there. Mono Red Mice. If you recall a couple of weeks prior, I'm pretty sure there was a week where Red Mice was over 30% meta share for top 32s. And we went down to 28.1, and now we're all the way back down to 20%. So maybe Pioneer is back? Question mark? Second place here, Rakdos Demons up a little bit from 9.9 to 13.5. Orzhov Monument, that's a big one. 4.7 all the way up to 9.8. That's more than doubled what it was last week. So huge shift there. Mono Black. What happened to the Mono Black cards? 9.4% of the top 32 last week, 1.2% this week. Basically non-existent. Another one, Is It Creativity? 5.2 last week, 0.6 this week. So the metagame really seems to be shifting underneath the kind of like Red Mice Demons, sort of Red Mice and Demons, sort of 1 and 2. Also, what the heck happened to Is It Phoenix? Last week, 4.7%. This week, only 2.5%. When did people decide that Phoenix was bad? Pioneer players, sound off in the comments below, because, Treasure Cruise is still legal, right? Boros Hammer, here's another one. 2.6 last week, 6.1% this week. So Boros Hammer did not win, but did put up a couple of top 8s in terms of challenges this weekend. We're going to take a look at one of those lists, don't worry. There's some new additions, but it's mostly just a lot of the cards that, I think it was a couple weeks prior. I think it was a week after Edge of Eternities came out. There was a couple of Boros Hammer lists, and some people have been slightly iterating on those, but we'll get to that in a second. Celestia Angels, 2.6% last week, 5.5 this week, winning 2 challenges. 5 challenges, 2 of them won by Angels, 2 of them won by Azorius Control, which is pretty funny because that's like the 0% matchup for Angels. So maybe the Control players beat up on some Angels players. And then, from there, there's some small changes here, like Mono White Humans and Esper Legends, which basically didn't exist last week. Now they're 3.7 and 3.1 respectively. And just like some cool fluctuation within the back end of the format. So I don't know, Pioneer looking pretty good. Maybe I'll have to give it a try. And if I do give it a try, I'm probably going to play one of the following deck lists. In the first deck I wanted to take a look at here from Moon 11 in 23rd place. Not a lot of new cards here, but I did want to highlight Boros Convoke seems to be a pretty good home for Cosmogran Zenith. This deck, as you can see, has 16 1-mana creatures and also 8 0-mana creatures. So it seems pretty trivial to be able to double spell with Cosmogran Zenith. I'm a little curious as to why only 2 copies. It is a 3-mana card, and this deck has an extremely low curve, so I can sort of understand why only 2 copies, but I kind of want to get some more in there, to be honest with you. It seems really good in this deck. So, nothing else really has changed for this deck. Just wanted to highlight the inclusion of Cosmogrand into Boros Convoke, because looks pretty good. And here is the aforementioned Boros Hammer deck lists from Mick Winsauce in 7th place. One of the challenges, I believe this was the Friday challenge. And so a lot of these cards are what we were playing with roughly maybe a couple weeks ago, because I had actually tried out a Hammer deck list on Arena because we finally got Kazul's Toll Collector. Now, the one inclusion here from Edge of Eternities that I wanted to highlight is reroute systems. It might seem pretty insignificant and a little bit of just a small sort of side grade, but this is 1 white for an instant that says choose one, target artifact or creature gains indestructible until end of turn, or it deals 2 damage to a tapped creature. So not only can this protect your creature from Fatal Push the turn that they're going, so like if you set up a turn where you go Sigarda's Aid, Colossus Hammer on a guy and try to one-shot them, you can not only protect the creature from Fatal Push, you can also importantly protect the Colossus Hammer from something like a Braid. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of like setting up the combo and protecting your combo when they have the removal spell, and it protects either piece. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And it can also just be a kill spell, right? You have something like, what's the name of Lauren's Escape, right? Target permanent you control gains indestructible, scry 1, but that one doesn't kill a creature. So this one has some more flexibility, which I like. Only down to 2 Mox Ambers, which I find a little strange because we still have Freya, Cloud, Kemba, and Kellen. So very curious to see only 2 Moxes. Still playing the Cutters, the 4 Hammers, obviously, but good looking list. So again, small new inclusion from Edge of Eternities, but I'm sure makes a lot of sense. Shout out to 2022 Standard. They called and they wanted their deck back from Davi Morais in 8th place here with a 4-3 record. I believe that's after the top 8 loss, so I think they might have been 4-2 into the top 8. But this is Esper Legends. Now, for people who were playing Standard back when Raffine's Scheming Seer was legal, you might have some nightmares about this deck because it was basically everywhere during that Standard format. And to be honest with you, there's not a lot of new cards in this deck list compared to what we had in the Standard format, right? Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Danik, Pious Apprentice, Deep Cavern Bat, Skrelv. The 2 new big additions here, which they are probably the 2 of the better cards in the deck, so makes sense, is Cecil Dark Knight. It's a legend. It costs 1 mana. It's extremely powerful. Makes a lot of sense. And Dark Confidant, because your curve is relatively low. You do have 2 Kaitos and 2 Shieldred, so, you gotta be a little careful there. But other than that, it's like all 1s and 2s, basically, with the Raffines, so makes a lot of sense. The one thing that's interesting to me is that we are playing this many Legends, but no Mox Ambers. So, a little curious about that. Like, Mox Amber into turn 2 Raffine sounds kind of gas, not gonna lie. So I would maybe consider deploying some Mox Ambers in here. The other big difference is the mana base, right? Back during Standard, when Raffine was legal, we didn't necessarily have access to all of these lands, like Starting Town and Watery Grave. I don't even remember if Concealed Courtyard was out when Raffine was legal. That was OTJ. It might have been, I can't remember. But in any case, sweet looking deck list. Again, I'd probably change it up a little bit, play a couple Mox Ambers, but if you are into the sort of like Esper mid-range Legends kind of thing, if you're a Raffine lover, this deck list is probably for you. And last but not least, for the Pioneer section from Kanara 38204, lost in the finals of a challenge with... You're going to have to let me know in the comments what we're supposed to call this. I labeled this in my spreadsheet as Dimir Demons, but maybe Esper Demons or 4-color Demons is more appropriate. So we have a Demons deck. There is 4 copies of Unholy Annex. I feel you kind of need to call this a Demons deck with the 4 annexes. The funny synergy here is Raffine's Scheming Seer. If you look at the creature types, yeah, that's a Sphinx Demon, all right. So you can actually curve into Annex into turn 5 Ritual Chamber. That's kind of cool. The Shikos, notably not a demon. I'm not sure what we're doing with the Shikos. I mean, being able to flashback something like a Fatal Push or a Thoughtseize does seem pretty appealing. We got some Valkies in here. My guess is these were just getting... Oh, I see. Okay, I think that's where we're doing here. I didn't even realize this when I was looking. Jace Valky, some synergy there, because you can plot the Valky and then cast it for free. So that is something you can do there. You do have a lot of Legends for Nashi, so a lot of cards you can pick up there. Nashi can also mill for Shiko, so there's some cool stuff going on here. It just looks kind of weird seeing it all together in one deck list, but I don't know. This person has been putting up a lot of results with this deck list over basically for the past 4 months. So maybe something to take a look at. In any case, that is going to do it for the Pioneer section. And unfortunately, we have to take a look at Standard, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so if you ignore the top left-hand box of your screen for just a moment, don't look at that yet. If you're just looking at the graph, it's not that bad, right? Cauldron last week was 33.3%. That number has gone down to 25%. Again, only top 32, so keep that in mind. Dimir midrange went up from 14.6 to 19.3. So there seems to be a little bit of jockeying for position in terms of the best two decks in the format, which are very clearly Izzet and Dimir. From there, you have a little bit of a downtick in Pixie, Azorius Control about the same, Mono Red and Boros Mice down significantly, Prowess making a bit of a resurgence, which kind of, if you look at the numbers, right, Cauldron has gone down about 8%, and then Prowess has gone up from 3.1 to 7.8, so rough, almost about 5%. So maybe the people that were playing Cauldron last week, those people switched to Prowess this week. And then from there, as you can see, look at this Mono Red Dragons. Last week, 1%, this week, 9.4%. So huge uptick in Mono Red Dragons. It is a deck that I spent a little bit of time playing, but I'll admit, not a ton, so maybe something I have to revisit testing for Orlando. And then from there, there's kind of the rest of the Standard format, right? Not a ton of other changes there, but big uptick in Prowess, big uptick in Dragons, uptick in Dimir, a little bit of a downtick in Cauldron. So if you're just looking at the graph, it might look pretty good. Well, then you take a look at the left-hand side of your screen, and you'll notice that of the 6 challenges that took place this past weekend, 5 of them were won by Izzet Cauldron. Let's look at some deck lists, shall we? The first deck that I want to show you is not quite Mono Red Dragons, but I did label it as such because this was the only version of Dragons that wasn't actually Mono Red. But honestly, I think I like this version a little bit better. So the Dragon core of Sarkhan Dragon Ascendant, Nova Hellkite, Twin Maw Stormbrood, we still have all of that stuff. But instead of playing Taurine Mauler, we've replaced those and we're splashing white for Clarion Conqueror. Now, given how much of a complete dominant metagame threat that Izzet Cauldron is, makes sense to play this card. Turns off Cauldron, turns off the mana ability of Vivi. I guess that's really it, but those are the 2 best cards in their deck list, so turning off both of them does kind of make sense. It is a little awkward because it turns off Hired Claw, it turns off Treasures from Magda, Treasures from Sarkhan. I thought there was one other thing that it turned off, but I may be mistaken. So it's a little awkward with some of your draws, but I mean, it's powerful enough against Cauldron that I do think it makes sense to play it. Also, a couple of Magmatic Hellkites. Not all of the Dragon's deck are playing this card. What they are all playing is 4 copies of Nova Hellkite. And the more that I play with and against this card is completely messed up. I've been so impressed every single time that I've had it cast against me or I've casted myself. And I want to try and find some more decks to put this card into, because this one is the real deal. Another Boros deck and another deck with main deck Clarion Conqueror. You'll notice a theme here. This one here from Glowin Hammerfist, 23rd place. So we don't have any Dragons cards here, but we do have some taxes cards. So we have ways to punish our opponent for drawing extra cards with Razorkin Needlehead. I don't know if you've taken a look at the composition of the Izzet Cauldron deck, but roughly about 20 cards in their deck say draw 2 or 3 cards on them. So if they somehow can't kill a 2-mana 2/2, they probably can. But if they can't, then they take a lot of damage, right? We still have the Clarion Conquerors here to turn off the Cauldrons and the VVs. We have some Aven Interrupters, which pair very nicely with Lightstall Inquisitor, because Lightstall on turn 1 is going to exile a card from their hand. Then it says, while exiled, they can play that card for paying an additional mana. Aven Interrupter has this text on it that says, spells your opponent's cast from graveyards or exile cost 2 more. So if they don't play the spell by turn 3, then you can kind of get them with the Aven Interrupter. Only 2 Hellkites. We probably want to up those numbers a little bit. Voice of Victory, Magebane Lizard in the main deck, Veteran Survivor, and Militant for Graveyard Hate. Just like a very, very like hateful taxes style Boros deck. Again, not sure about some of the card choices, but it's definitely an interesting approach. Shout out to Randy MTG for this next deck list here, Boros Manufacturing. I saw this deck list and I wasn't 100% sure, but there's definitely some things that I like about this. Mainly 4 copies of Tezzeret Cruel Captain, because I have been trying to make this card work since Edge came out, and I haven't really found the best shell for it yet. This might be one of the shells that has a lot of potential, because your curve is very low. You have 4 Clockwork, 4 Cavron Harrier, 4 Nesting Bot, and 4 Dusk Rose. So you have 16 1-mana artifacts to pump up Tezzeret, along with the weapons manufacturing. So you have kind of like both Tezzeret and weapons want you to play a bunch of cheap artifacts, which you have 16 of them. And then you can use Tezzeret to find more cheap artifacts. Legion Extruder can sacrifice the weapons tokens alongside Torch and Dusk Rose. The Perilous Snares are a little weird. They look kind of out of place just because the rest of the curve is so low and this doesn't sacrifice anything. But it is a good catch-all removal spell and is an artifact that triggers both Tezzeret and weapons, so it kind of makes sense. And then in the mana base, we have a Scene of the Crime and some Fountain Ports to be able to utilize these to sacrifice weapons. So you'll notice that this deck doesn't really have a sack outlet per se, like a traditional sack outlet like Umbral Caller Zealot or Phantom Train to be able to one-shot sack all the munitions. But that's because that card doesn't exist in red or white. You would have to dip into a third color if you wanted that type of effect, which maybe you do, right? Maybe there is a potential to splash something like a Zealot to have that one-shot kill potential with manufacturing. Time will tell if that's something that you want to do, but I think this is a pretty good starting point, so good-looking deck, Randy. And last but certainly not least, shout out to DB_Dykeman for some Orzhov self-bounce. Before we take a look at the rest of this deck list, how many... Be honest with me, okay? If you're still watching the video up until this point, let me know in the comment section down below, how many of you knew that Desecration Demon was legal in Standard before watching this video? Shout out to Foundations, by the way. So this is an Orzhov self-bounce deck. Now, this one is much higher on the mana curve. That's why we're playing 26 lands, but we're playing 4 copies of Unholy Annex, and I thought there was no Fountain Ports in the mana base, but we do have 4 Soulstone Sanctuary. But basically, this is kind of like utilizing Annex with something like Desecration Demon as your heavy-hitting top of the curve for the Pixie deck, where you have the Pixie stuff, which is 4 Pixie, 4 Kieran, 4 Seam Rip, 4 Momentum Breaker, 4 Nowhere to Run. I mentioned Seam Rip here because against some decks, if you Seam Rip a token, you can then bounce the Seam Rip with Nurturing Pixie to replay it, but I guess for the most part, it's just Breaker and Nowhere. But you can use Pixie and Kieran to set up Trajectory, because Trajectory is just a very powerful removal spell. And then you have some good interaction, and then you're pairing that with sticky threats like Acolyte, Desecration Demon, and Unholy Annex. Cool thing about Desecration Demon that I kind of just realized when I was talking about this, if they're in a position where they have to sacrifice some small creature to the demon, that gives you a free void for Tragic Trajectory. So that's kind of cool. I didn't even think about that. And then obviously the Soul Stones to pair with the Annexes. And then from there, you got good sideboard cards, Duress, Get Lost, all that kind of stuff. So interesting take on the Pixie deck list, where that's like higher land count, higher mana curve, more 4-drops, more 5-drops with Annex. Not necessarily the approach that I was thinking for Pixie, but maybe one that's worth trying. And with all of that, my friends, thank you all again so much for watching. That's going to wrap up this week's episode of Watching the Meta. Be sure to leave a comment in the comment section down below. What was your favorite deck from today's video? And let's see if something can maybe dethrone Izzet Cauldron next week. I doubt it's going to win 5 challenges again, right? Stay tuned to find out next week, and I'll see you then.